Welcome to EPG Pathshala on the course of History and Ideologies of Social Work. My name is Murli Desai. I'm a former professor from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Today's topic is Western Ideologies in the Modern Period, Phase 2. We have already discussed the modern ideologies of rationalism, liberalism, democracy, etc. in the previous class. Today we are going to look at nationalism, social Darwinism, and how it led to colonialism. Now let us see what is nationalism, and before that what are nations. For a long time countries were thought of as kingdoms. This king's kingdom and that king's kingdom, and not as a particular nation. However, when the French Revolution carried out its agitations, the French people who were understood to be the French nation. For the first time, the concept of nation was emerging. It is very clearly linked to the concept of democracy. It is very clearly linked to the concept of rule by the people. Now, on the most basic level, nations are collections of people bound together by shared values and traditions. In particular, a common language, religion, and history are what are shared, and they usually occupy the same geographical area. Now, there is a very different take on nations and nationalism by the thinkers of the 20th century. Rabindranath Tagore differentiates a nation from a society as follows. According to him, a nation is a political union of people, which a whole population assumes when organized for a mechanical purpose. Now, what he means by that, we'll see a little later. On the other hand, he stresses that a society is an end in itself, a spontaneous self-expression of human beings as social beings. So to him, society is a much superior construct to a nation. Now, let us look at the concept of the state. The states can be understood to encompass the following systems: the judicial and legal institutions, the public bureaucracy, legislative institutions, and political parties. These comprise the state. And as we have seen in history and we'll see further, the state represents the interests of the powerful and the landed class. Now, what happens to the construct of nation states? We discussed what is a nation, we discussed what is a state. Nation states are when the boundaries between nation and state are blurred. They are based on liberal ideology, and there is a common territory. There is this whole political apparatus that we just saw in the previous slide of authority and control, and this rule that supposedly by the people, but more to protect the interest of the industrialist and commercial group. This creates a sovereign political body possessing authority over all activities within a given territorial sphere, with those people residing within it becoming its legitimate subjects. I'll just give one example to understand this concept with reference to when there were no nation states. For example, if you take the kingdom, and people who are living in that kingdom ruled by a particular king and his dynasty, for example. Now, what happens? Does the king have laws for everything that is happening in the village, in that particular kingdom? No. The king basically had rules about its army, it had rules about the tax that he would collect, and it had its own form of law, selective law for selective issues that came up. So if you look at all these other systems that the state is supposed to have, the kingdoms had very few of those. So it did not control all aspects of people's lives. People lived their lives, communities had their own rules, Communities had their own systems of regulating certain moralities, but there were no laws of policing or armies controlling people. So these are nation states that emerged as a result of the European Revolution. To further understand nation states, it's a larger system. It involves millions of people occupying a large geographical area. If it's a smaller one, they are called city-states. The members of nation states think of themselves as belonging to a distinct people or nation, separate from their neighbors. Now, this separate from their neighbors is very important in the concept of nation states. It allows people to work together politically on a large scale through the creation of common political identities. These are also called imagined communities, as unlike face-to-face communities, their very existence depends on a collective act of imagination. Here again, the example of India. I mean, there will be more linkage of one's identity to where one is living. I live in Chembur, for example. For example, I work at this particular place, or this is my religion, or this is my mother tongue, and these are the groups that I interact with. That face-to-face communities are real communities because they are important in your day-to-day interactions. Whereas to think of even Maharashtra as my state or India as my country, these are imagined communities in terms, they are there, not that they are not there. But for a lay person, you're supposed to be loyal to certain constructs that you have not experienced. Okay. Now, what is nationalism to do with these constructs of nations, states, and nation states? The development of nation states was followed by the ideology of nationalism. It is an ideology based on the premise that individuals' loyalty and devotion to the nation state surpass all other interests. You have to be more loyal to your nation than to your state, to your mother tongue, your religion, and so on. Flags, national anthems, patriotic poetry and literature, public ceremonies, national holidays, these are all tools that are developed for people to show their loyalty. Later on, when time permits, we should discuss how these are relevant in today's times. Nationalism thus became the language of mass politics, made possible by the growth of education, mass literacy, and the spread of newspapers. As I said a little earlier, that difference between my nation and other nation is very important for the concept of nation, and therefore also for the ideology of nationalism. It is based basically on the spirit of conflict, that I am not that nation, I belong to this nation, okay? And it increasingly becomes chauvinistic, that my nation is better than the other nation, that I need to show my superiority to the other nations. So this kind of nationalism with a sense of unique or superior qualities and considering other nations as untrustworthy, even menacing, became part of this concept of nationalism. It was considered good and desirable to hate your neighbors, to say that you are better than your neighbors. Such nationalism in European countries is what led to colonial expansion into Asian and African countries in the 19th century. This spread of nationalism in Asia and Africa also led to a sense of nationalism among the colonies. This nationalism was against the colonial rule because of the realization that this is my nation, but somebody else's nation is ruling us. Okay, the whole, the events of world wars in the 20th century were also based on these international rivalries and suspicions based on this whole ideology of nationalism. Okay. Now let us look at another ideology and see how both nationalism and social Darwinism led to colonization. What is the historical context of social Darwinism? What does it mean? I guess again we have all studied in our schools about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution from his book on the origin of species. He proposes that each species on Earth undergoes a series of random physical and mental changes or mutations. Some of these changes enable a species to survive and prosper. Other mutations are less favorable and make survival more difficult or even impossible. So there is a natural selection process that has gone on. We've known how some species have gotten extinct over a period of time and are still going extinct over a period of time. So this happens because of this whole theory of physical, mental changes or mutations based on the need to survive. And some species that survive the changes in the environment and some species that don't survive. Now this theory of Charles Darwin of evolution influenced the social scientists by the end of the 19th century. And they started applying this to the society. These are the people who were called social Darwinists. Now let's see what they have to say. Social Darwinists use the theory of natural selection to develop the social principle of the survival of the fittest. What does this mean? It comprises this whole idea that inequalities of wealth, social position and political power are natural and inevitable, and no attempt should be made by government to interfere with them. Why? Because this whole nature is about survival of the fittest. Successful business people were responsible for their own status, and that the unsuccessful were getting what they deserved. Organizations that show a profit are ipso facto both successful and desirable without regard to how the profit is produced, and those that cannot show a profit thereby indicate they are unfit to survive. So whatever has proved its fitness by continuing to exist, such as the species that continue, whatever exists is fittest to exist. Everything therefore is as should be. This is the basic core idea of social Darwinism. What are the implications of social Darwinism? This ideology became a rationalization for racism, of inequalities, prejudices, a whole lot of things, because it was used to prove the inferiority of some groups by the fact that their economic status was low or their educational attainments were inferior and their social status were undesirable. This aspect of social Darwinism resulted in the displacement of equality by equality of opportunity. Earlier, the concept of equality was important. But because everyone is not same, so equality of opportunity is what is considered more important by social Darwinists. As equality obviously had not been achieved, it was dismissed as anti-evolutionary and therefore unnatural. Instead, equality of opportunity is more important because it provides same platform for everyone to move further. Social Darwinism thus divided people into hierarchical dichotomies of worthy and not worthy. So if you are wealthy, you're wealthy because you're worthy, and if you're poor, that's because you are not worthy. Deserving and non-deserving. And these dichotomies led to the dichotomy of haves and have-nots. The Protestant ethics that we discussed earlier made the negatively defined seem immoral, and the liberalists made them appear deviant, as they are presumably uninterested in competing with others in the open market. They were justifiably refused the fundamental life support resources were even deemed expendable. Now, how nationalism and social Darwinism led to colonization and colonialism? Let us see the historical context first. There were two events in 1490s that marked the beginning of history of colonialism. One was landing of Christopher Columbus in the Americas, and second was landing of Vasco da Gama in India. Over a period of time in the 18th century, the European powers began to establish extensive trading networks in Latin America and Asia. The Industrial Revolution made European nationalism aggressive and expansionist and promoted international trade and colonization in these countries. The European nationalists advantaged positions to increase the productive capacities of their own economies, acquired command over the resources of also the people of the colonies to reinforce their own home economies. The colonialism succeeded also because the elite in the colonies collaborated with the foreign rulers as trading partners and later administrators. By the 19th century, the European empires were ruling or controlling 9/10 of the entire globe through this phenomenon of colonization. Now, colonization was justified by the ideology of social Darwinism and Eurocentrism. We saw how nationalism led to this aggressive expansionist approach and incentives that led to these international trades and also controlling other countries through colonization. Social Darwinism and Eurocentrism worked on the mindsets. As we saw, social Darwinism had led to racism, and it considered the wealthy as deserving. Similarly, they considered the colonizers deserving to colonize and the colonized deserving to be ruled by foreign countries, because it was heavily influenced by this doctrine of that all the nations have had their freedom to grow and prosper, okay, but all have not, and the European countries have progressed more than these countries, so they deserve to rule those countries. Aided by scientism, again further dichotomies were used to justify colonization, such as primitive and civilized, backward and advanced, superstitious and scientific. Similarly, Eurocentrism invented the eternal West and took the center stage of the world. What does it mean? It means superiority of the European culture. Okay, it denied the pre-Renaissance development in the rest of the world, mainly from Middle East onwards, India, China, etc., and reduced them to the periphery of the world. The introduction of the British education and legal structures devalued the local systems of knowledge and jurisprudence and promoted Eurocentrism through their own new systems. What were the implications of colonialism and Eurocentrism? Secular hierarchies, imposition of the colonial state, etc. And let us look at each of these in detail. Let us move to secular hierarchies first. Colonialism won its great victories not through military, not so much through military. There was some violence, but not so much through military wars or technological prowess as through its ability to create secularism. This is very interesting to note, that it's secularism that was their strength, which led to their, which was important in justifying as well as in an important implication. Secularism was incompatible with the traditional order, which was religion-based. And as a result, secularism and colonization opened up new vistas for those who were exploited in the traditional order. For example, Dalits in India got jobs in quite a few British systems that were established. The new order actually in the beginning looked like the first step towards a more just and equal world. However, this kind of secularism also created a whole lot of hierarchies that were harmful. It created hierarchies of absolute superiority of the human over the non-human. The whole process of industrialization has used this hierarchy to use nature for the sake of benefit of the human beings. And today we know how that has led to mass-scale degradation of the environment. Superiority of the masculine over the feminine. Women were relegated to being housewives as a result of the industrialization and also colonization, which reinforced certain patriarchal values. The adult over the child, the historical over the ahistorical. African and Asian countries were known to be ahistorical in the sense they had long histories, but they didn't have recorded histories. So that was again considered inferior. And these European countries were modern, so progressive, and the colonized countries were traditional because they were savages. The word savage was actually used for these countries. So the polarities between modern and primitive, secular, non-secular, scientific, unscientific, expert, layman, developed, underdeveloped, whole lot of polarizations started emerging in the societies. Now, implications of the colonial state, as we saw what a state is, and we also know that India was not a state, India was not a nation at that time. India had several small kingdoms. So, it was an alien system that came to rule India during the colonial rule. This alien system of rational centralized state of the colonizers was imposed on the complex and heterogeneous realities of the developing societies. And colonial state was a source of legitimate violence. As we discussed earlier, they had the control through police, through the army, and through laws. So, a distinction, so this brought about more control over the developing countries. And there was direct as well as indirect rule, because they sometimes empowered the local rulers or the feudal lords to collect taxes, to implement and enforce their rules and laws on the people. It is interesting to note that before colonization also there was a global system. There was a pre-existing global system of trade across countries which was destroyed. Now, what kind of system was existing? At least 2000 years ago, the global system was organized around three major centers of India, China and Middle East, while Africa, Japan and Southeast Asia were also involved, but on the peripheries of these major centers. There were intensive relations not only of exchange of goods, but also of technologies, knowledge, philosophies, religion, and so on. We know about the Silk Road from China right up to the Middle East. We also know how Buddhism spread from India to the eastern and southeastern countries, because there were these existing infrastructures. However, the difference between what colonization brought at the global level was that the earlier exchanges were more or less on an equal basis. There were exchanges, there were trades. Not that there was no inequality. It was there, but they were more or less on an exchange basis. Whereas colonization brought about polarization at the global level, never before seen in the history of humanity. The old global system was destroyed and replaced by the modern capitalist globalization, which only had the benefit to the Western countries in mind as an objective. The production, the developments of industrialization were all done with the aim of more production for the colonizers at the expense of the colonies. Colonies also had industrialization. If we don't take industrialization in the narrow sense of steam engine, factories and and so on. There was manufacturing in the developing countries. Now these manufacturing base of these countries were deindustrialized, and for the sake of industrialization and revolution in England. About 35 million persons might have been displaced from the urban to rural areas as a result of this deindustrialization. Laws regarding the land use and ownership pattern were changed in order to make land available for plantations and mines needed for raw materials. We also know a whole lot of land which was used for food crops were changed into lands for cash crops such as coffee and tea. The economies of the colonies were not developed beyond the small but important sectors needed by the European economies. Capital and raw material were obtained from the colonies, and what it resulted in was collapse of civilizations, genocide, enslavement, capture of resources, and subservience of economies. Imposition of individualism was another implication of colonization. As we all know, in the pre-industrial societies of India, there were more collectives and more collectivism as an ideology of society, whereas colonization brought about imposition of the individualistic culture of the industrialized Western colonizers to these collectivistic societies. So in conclusion, today we saw what modern Western ideologies brought about colonization, and basically we looked at nationalism and we looked at social Darwinism. We went into details of how nationalism made the European nation states more aggressive, because that ideology embodies the spirit of conflict and conquest, and therefore it played an important role in colonization. On the other hand, social Darwinism, which comprises basically of inequality and racism as natural, justified colonization with reference to the perceived superiority of the West. And colonization and Eurocentrism, which is the superiority of the European countries, brought about secular hierarchies, imposition of the colonial state, deindustrialization and economic exploitation, destruction of pre-existing global system, and imposition of individualism, among other impacts in the developing countries. Thank you very much, and follow up on concepts that are a little vague, a little difficult to understand, but what is more important is the story of how ideologies are impacting social change. Thank you.